Welcome back. Today we are stepping onto a wooden sidewalk on a warm September morning in the year 1900, on a dusty street called Spring, in a small city of barely more than 100,000 people that almost nobody outside of California could have found on a map. Horse-drawn wagons creak past you loaded with oranges. A streetcar bell rings somewhere behind a row of two-story brick storefronts. The air smells faintly of citrus blossom, horse manure, and the dry sage of hills that still ring the town on every side. You would have no reason to suspect that within 20 years, almost everything around you would be gone, torn down, paved over, or buried beneath a metropolis so vast it would swallow its own memory whole. Using AI reconstruction, restored photographs, and the hand-painted views left behind by early California artists, we are going to walk through this vanished Los Angeles exactly as it stood, street by street, before revealing, at the end, exactly what remains of it today, standing in the same spots more than a century later. To understand this moment, you have to go back further still, to a settlement that began in 1781 as a dusty Spanish outpost called El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de Los Angeles, founded by a small group of settlers, most of mixed indigenous, African, and Spanish descent, who arrived from Mexico under orders from a Spanish governor. For decades it remained a modest farming village built around a central plaza, watered by a hand-dug ditch called the Zanja Madre, the mother ditch, that carried water from the Los Angeles River to fields of corn, beans, and grapevines. There was no railroad, no harbor to speak of, and no reason to believe this cluster of adobe houses would ever become anything more than a sleepy cattle town on the edge of empire. The people plowing those fields in 1800 had no concept of oil derricks, movie cameras, or freeways. They knew only sun, drought, flood, and the rhythm of the seasons. By 1900, that pueblo had transformed into a compact but genuinely bustling American city of roughly 102,000 residents, a number that had more than tripled in just 15 years thanks to a ferocious real estate boom in the late 1880s. Broadway and Spring Street formed the commercial spine of downtown, lined with ornate Victorian and Romanesque buildings 3 and 4 stories tall. Their facades built from brick and sandstone, their windows framed in carved stone garlands. The Bradbury Building, completed in 1893, rose along Broadway with an interior court of wrought iron, open elevators, and a glass skylight that flooded the space with California sun. A design so striking it was rumored the architect had drawn inspiration from a futuristic novel about the year 2000. Just a few blocks away, Bunker Hill climbed steeply above the business district, its slopes crowned with elaborate Victorian mansions belonging to bankers and merchants, connected to the flatlands below by a peculiar and much-loved funicular railway called Angel's Flight, which had opened at the very end of 1901 and carried riders up a 28-degree incline for a single cent. Even at its most polished, this city was still visibly under construction. Streets were being regraded, sewer lines dug, and telephone poles strung with wire in every direction. A town caught mid-transformation rather than a finished creation. At the heart of civic and spiritual life stood the old plaza, still anchored by the whitewashed adobe walls of the Church of Our Lady Queen of the Angels, built in 1822 and rebuilt several times since. Its bell tower calling worshippers to Mass in a neighborhood where Spanish, Mexican, Chinese, and American influences all pressed against one another within a few square blocks. Just to the east of the plaza sat Los Angeles' original Chinatown, a dense warren of narrow lanes, herbal apothecaries, joss houses, and family association halls, home to several thousand Chinese immigrants who had first arrived to build the railroads and stayed to run laundries, restaurants, and produce stalls despite decades of discriminatory laws designed to push them out. A few blocks further sat the county courthouse and a scattering of civic buildings where land disputes, water rights cases, and business contracts were argued daily. Disputes that mattered enormously in a desert city where the ownership of water was, quite literally, the ownership of the future. Walk the ordinary streets of 1900 Los Angeles and you would find a surprisingly cosmopolitan mix of working lives. Citrus packers loaded wooden crates stamped with colorful orange grove labels onto freight cars bound east. Oil derricks, crude wooden towers that had begun sprouting near present-day Echo Park and west of downtown just a few years earlier, filled entire blocks with the smell of crude petroleum. Since Los Angeles was, by 1900, one of the largest oil-producing regions in the country. Newsboys hawked the Los Angeles Times and the Herald on street corners. Streetcars belonging to several competing companies clanged along Spring and Main, carrying clerks, laundresses, and lawyers alike, while horses still outnumbered automobiles by a staggering margin, since the first gasoline car had only appeared on local streets a handful of years before. Saloons, boarding houses, and Chinese grocery stalls crowded together within a few blocks of elegant new department stores, and graffiti like chalk advertisements for boxing matches and traveling circuses covered fences and lampposts. It was a loud, dusty, sun-bleached town of roughly 100,000 souls that somehow felt both provincial and electric with anticipation. If you wanted spectacle in 1900, you might have gone to Hazard's Pavilion, a cavernous wooden hall near the plaza that could seat several thousand people for boxing matches, political rallies, opera performances, and revival meetings. A single flexible space that served as the city's arena, theater, and civic auditorium all at once, since Los Angeles did not yet have the population to support separate grand venues for each. It had already hosted a Democratic national gathering, prize fights that drew rowdy crowds from across the county, and traveling vaudeville troupes, and it stood as a genuine point of civic pride, proof that this desert town could host events worthy of a real city. For a glimpse of private wealth, you needed only climb Bunker Hill itself, where mansions like the Bradbury Mansion and the ornate Victorian homes lining Fort Moore Hill displayed turrets, wraparound porches, and imported European furnishings, the private domain of oil investors, bankers, and citrus barons who had ridden the boom of the 1880s to sudden fortune. Their parlors held pianos shipped around Cape Horn. Their gardens boasted exotic palms recently popularized as symbols of the semi-tropical good life California promised to newcomers. Yet whatever wealth and comfort sat behind those carved doors, the forces about to remake this city would not spare Bunker Hill's grand houses any more than they would spare the modest bungalows and boarding houses down in the flats below. The turning point for old Los Angeles was not a single violent catastrophe like a fire or an earthquake, but something arguably more transformative: water and the astonishing growth it unlocked. In 1904 and 1905, the city's water superintendent, William Mulholland, and a group of prominent boosters engineered the purchase of water rights in the distant Owens Valley, roughly 230 miles to the north, and began construction on an aqueduct that would eventually stretch across desert and mountain to deliver that water to Los Angeles. When the aqueduct opened in November of 1913, Mulholland reportedly declared to the assembled crowd, in a moment many historians describe as brief and blunt, that the water had arrived and was theirs to use. Almost immediately, cheap water and cheap land triggered explosive annexation and growth. By 1920, the city's population had rocketed past 500,000, and by 1930 past 1 million, an expansion so rapid that it demanded the systematic demolition of the very neighborhoods that had defined the 1900 city. Old Chinatown was cleared in the early 1930s to make way for Union Station. Much of the original Bunker Hill Mansion district was condemned and bulldozed during a sweeping urban renewal campaign in the 1950s and 1960s, its Victorian rooflines replaced first by parking lots, then by steel and glass towers. The hill itself was even physically lowered, its elevation cut down by more than 100 feet to ease construction, an act that many longtime residents experienced almost like watching a mountain vanish. In the decades that followed, the physical fabric of 1900 Los Angeles was largely erased rather than destroyed all at once. A slower and in some ways quieter loss, one demolition permit at a time, until entire blocks that had once anchored the city's identity survived only in photographs, insurance maps, and the memories of an aging generation. Many of Bunker Hill's mansions were carted off before demolition and offered for a token price to anyone willing to move them, though few takers ever came, and most were simply torn down for scrap lumber. The original Zanja Madre, the mother ditch that had watered the pueblo for a century, was paved over and forgotten beneath modern streets. It was really only from the 1970s onward that historians, preservationists, and civic groups began systematically rediscovering what had been lost, digitizing glass plate negatives from early photography studios, restoring surviving structures like the Bradbury Building, and piecing together detailed maps of the vanished Chinatown and Bunker Hill neighborhoods through oral histories and insurance survey records. What surprised many researchers was just how cosmopolitan and architecturally ambitious this supposedly sleepy western town had actually been, a place already wired for electricity and telephones, already debating urban planning and water rights, already home to immigrant communities living complex, layered lives well before Hollywood ever put Los Angeles on the world's cultural map. It is worth pausing here simply to remember that these were not just old photographs of buildings, but homes where families ate breakfast, offices where clerks worried over ledgers, sidewalks where children ran errands for parents who could never have imagined the city their town would become. Every faded storefront held a life as real and immediate as your own. Today, if you walk that same stretch of Broadway, the Bradbury Building still stands, its wrought iron staircases and skylight beautifully preserved and open to visitors and film crews alike. Angel's Flight was dismantled in 1969, and though it has been rebuilt and relocated a short distance from its original site, it still climbs a version of that same hill on the same 1-cent-turned-modern fare journey. The old Plaza Church still holds Mass just as it did in 1900, one of the very few buildings in this story that has never stopped serving its original purpose. Chinatown was rebuilt several blocks northwest of its original location after the historic district was cleared for Union Station, which itself now stands as a Mission Revival landmark where the old Chinese Quarter once sprawled. Bunker Hill's Victorian mansions are entirely gone, replaced by the glass towers of the financial district, though a handful of preserved photographs and a few historical plaques mark where specific homes once stood. Hazard's Pavilion was demolished decades ago and the site is now occupied by the Walt Disney Concert Hall, meaning that if you stand there today, you are standing on ground that has hosted grand public gatherings continuously for more than a century, even as every physical trace of the original building disappeared. Thank you so much for spending this time walking through a Los Angeles that almost nobody alive today ever saw with their own eyes. If there is a lost city, a vanished neighborhood, or a forgotten moment in history you would like us to reconstruct next, drop it in the comments below, and let us know what you thought of this one too. We read every suggestion, and we will see you again soon for another journey back in time.